In the ninth century, England did not exist. No single crown, no united people, no shared future. Across the land, fragile kingdoms teetered on loyalty, bloodlines, and fear. Power was inherited, but never guaranteed. Beyond the horizon, cold seas carried a new threat. The Vikings were coming, not merely to raid, but to stay. History often remembers warriors, kings glorified by sword, shield, and song. This story is different. It begins with a king who ruled without battle, a king who claimed power quietly, a king whose most dangerous choices were made in whispers, in shadows, and in silence. His name was Æthelbald of Wessex. 5 years of reign. No conquests, no glory. Yet scandals, moral dilemmas, and fractured trust shaped the future of a kingdom on the edge. This is not a story of heroism. It is the story of power, ambition, and survival. In the early ninth century, England was just a word, not a place. There was no shared identity, no single crown, no unified rule. Instead, there were fractured kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, each teetering on the edge of survival. Power was fragile, held only by loyalty, bloodlines, and the careful eyes of wary nobles. A king could rule today and fall tomorrow. Succession was never certain, and ambition often lurked closer than any invading army. Wessex endured longer than most, not because its warriors were the fiercest or its walls the strongest. It survived because it had learned caution. Every alliance, every decision, every whispered negotiation mattered. Every quiet choice could mean the difference between survival and collapse. This is the story of that fragile kingdom, and of the rulers who held it together when the world seemed determined to tear it apart. Æthelbald was never destined for legend. The second son of Æthelwulf, a king defined by patience, caution, and careful calculation. He was raised in a household where power was meant to pass smoothly, guided by faith, tradition, and preparation. But royal courts are never gentle. Ambition lurks in whispers, in sidelong glances, in the subtle games of influence. Æthelbald observed it all, who waited, who maneuvered, who ruled when the crown was absent. He learned quickly that kingship is not won by ceremony or inherited by right. It is measured in timing, in decisions made before others can act, in patience sharpened into strategy. In silence and observation, Æthelbald discovered his most dangerous tool, knowing when to step forward and when to wait. In 855, Æthelwulf departed Wessex for Rome. It was a journey of faith, a pilgrimage of devotion, and a maneuver of diplomacy. Yet in a kingdom without rigid institutions, absence was never neutral. Power left unattended is power tested. Authority wavered. Loyalties shifted. Whispers grew louder in candle-lit halls. Æthelbald watched, he waited, and he acted. He did not step aside. He did not defer. Where others might have hesitated, he moved decisively, claiming authority in a moment when kingdoms often fracture. It was a quiet kind of power, a dangerous kind of calculation, forged not on the battlefield but in observation, timing, and the understanding that survival sometimes demands bold choices before anyone else dares to act. There was no clash of swords, no grand proclamation. Æthelbald did not fight. He simply refused to relinquish authority. When Æthelwulf returned to Wessex, he confronted a dilemma no ruler should face: challenge his son and risk civil war, or yield and preserve fragile peace. He chose compromise. Power was shared, but trust fractured. Loyalties became fragile threads stretched across a divided kingdom. The crown was no longer a singular symbol of unity. It had become a mirror of ambition, negotiation, and uneasy alliances. In silence, Wessex had changed. What might have been a fleeting dispute became a defining moment. The lessons of authority, timing, and survival were etched into the kingdom's heart, shaping both father and son, and the uncertain future they would inherit. Æthelbald claimed the throne not with conquest, but through negotiation. No victory parades, no songs of glory, just a quiet, deliberate transfer of power. Yet legitimacy is never guaranteed. Nobles whispered, remembering how he rose. The church watched every move, weighing morality against authority. Every eye in Wessex measured him. And soon, Æthelbald would make a choice so shocking that even chroniclers struggled to make sense of it. A single decision would define his reign. A single act would fracture loyalties, scandalize the church, and isolate him from those he governed. In that moment, power became both a gift and a burden. A crown weighed not in gold or sword, but in silence, consequence, and the haunting certainty that some decisions change history forever. Æthelbald did not take the crown by force. He inherited it through compromise. When Æthelwulf died, the kingdom avoided civil war, but the cost was trust. Everyone in Wessex knew how Æthelbald had risen. Nobles remembered the quiet rebellion. Church leaders remembered the divided kingdom. Loyalty, once assumed, now had to be earned. In the 9th century, legitimacy mattered more than law. A king without trust ruled on borrowed time. Æthelbald sat on the throne, but the room was colder than it appeared. His authority was questioned in whispers, in council halls, and in monasteries where history would later be written. Unlike warrior kings, Æthelbald had no victories to silence doubt. He inherited stability, but stability is fragile when belief is gone. This was the tension at the heart of his reign, a king crowned but not fully accepted. The early years of Æthelbald's reign were quiet, almost unnervingly so. No major battles, no sweeping reforms, no declarations of strength. To some, this silence suggested stability. To others, weakness. Wessex lived in an uneasy calm. Viking threats still existed beyond the horizon, but the danger inside the kingdom felt closer. Æthelbald ruled carefully, aware that every decision would be judged against how he gained power. In a world where kings proved themselves through action, inaction spoke loudly. The court watched. The church observed. Nobles waited to see whether Æthelbald would define his reign or allow it to define him. Power, once seized quietly, demanded justification, and justification was coming. Before Æthelwulf's death, a woman arrived in Wessex whose presence would alter the course of its history. Her name was Judith. Young, noble, and Frankish, the daughter of a powerful continental king. Her marriage to Æthelwulf had elevated Wessex's standing in Europe, binding alliances that stretched far beyond England's shores. Yet Judith was more than a political emblem. She had been crowned queen, an extraordinary honor in Anglo-Saxon England. That coronation was not mere ceremony. It carried sacred authority, a weight that commanded attention and respect. And when Æthelwulf died, Judith did not depart. She remained at court, observing, calculating, waiting. Her presence would become a silent force, shaping loyalties, unsettling expectations, and influencing choices that would ripple through Wessex for years to come. Then Æthelbald made the choice that would define his reign and his legacy. He married Judith, not a distant cousin, not a foreign princess, but his father's widow. In the 9th century, such an act was not merely scandalous, it was unthinkable. Church law condemned it. Nobles whispered in shock. Chroniclers struggled to record it without judgment. This was no calculated strategy, no adherence to tradition. It was a transgression of sacred boundaries, a step beyond the limits of moral and social order. And the silence that followed was heavier than rebellion itself. Æthelbald had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed, leaving a mark on Wessex that would be felt long after his reign ended. From that moment, Æthelbald ruled alone. The church did not rise in rebellion, but it did not forgive. Monks recorded his marriage with quiet disapproval. Bishops offered no praise. Nobles withdrew their loyalty subtly, like shadows retreating, careful to avoid open defiance. Æthelbald held the crown, but he had lost moral authority. His reign endured, yet the wound remained. No great victories, no lasting reforms could erase the scandal. History does not remember him for what he achieved, but for what he shattered: trust, sacred boundaries, and the fragile respect of a kingdom. And while Wessex waited in uneasy silence, another boy watched from the wings, a younger brother. Observing, learning. His name was Alfred. In those quiet years, the seeds of a future king and the survival of a kingdom were being sown. The church did not rise against Æthelbald. It did something far more dangerous. It recorded. In the 9th century, monasteries were not passive places of prayer. They were the memory of the age. What monks chose to write, and how they chose to write it, determined how kings would be remembered long after death. Æthelbald's marriage was condemned not with swords but with ink. Chroniclers described it as improper, unlawful, and deeply troubling. There were no excuses offered, no context provided, just quiet disapproval preserved for centuries. This silence carried weight. In a world where kings relied on divine legitimacy, losing moral support meant ruling without heaven's favor. Æthelbald remained king, but the sacred foundation beneath him had cracked. Æthelbald's court continued to function, but without enthusiasm. Councils were held, orders were given, taxes collected. Yet something essential was missing: belief. No songs praised the king. No chronicles celebrated his wisdom. Nobles complied, but without devotion. This was the danger of ruling without legitimacy. Power could command obedience, but not loyalty. Æthelbald had inherited peace, yet peace without trust is brittle. Every quiet day raised the same unspoken question: why him? The king sensed it. His rule grew cautious, his decisions restrained. Inaction became policy, not by design but by necessity. Strangely, Æthelbald's reign passed without the clash of swords. The Viking threat loomed across the seas, relentless and patient, but it never struck Wessex with full force while he wore the crown. No battles were fought in his name. No victories could redeem his tarnished reputation. For an age defined by warriors, this was a dilemma. Kings were measured by courage in crisis, by their deeds on the battlefield. Æthelbald faced no great danger, and with none, he had no chance to rewrite how history would see him. Stability, once a blessing, became a silent burden, and history, ever unforgiving, does not remember what was avoided. It remembers what scandalized, what shocked, what fractured trust. Æthelbald's legacy was defined not by triumph, but by the quiet weight of choices that could not be undone. As the years unfolded, Æthelbald's court quietly contracted. Advisors drifted into the shadows. Noble families shifted their loyalties toward the future, toward a kingdom yet to come, leaving the present king with gestures instead of allegiance. Loyalty became private, measured in silence rather than ceremony. The king remained on the throne, but he was increasingly alone, surrounded by protocol, not trust, formality, not conviction. This was no act of tyranny. It was erosion. Power, once robust, slipped slowly and invisibly, grain by grain, until influence was measured in routine, ritual, and expectation rather than authority. Æthelbald still bore the crown, still ruled the kingdom, yet his reach had narrowed. His reign endured in form, but the force of his will had begun to fade, leaving Wessex poised on the edge of change. While Æthelbald ruled in quiet, the future was already awake. Younger brothers grew in strength and ambition. Nobles began weighing alternatives, testing loyalties, imagining what might come next. The fragile sense of continuity, once assumed, started to waver. Æthelbald had no children to secure his line, no heir to anchor speculation or reassure the realm. Each year without reform, without decisive action, made his reign feel temporary, like a shadow over Wessex rather than its light. And history, patient, unyielding, and impartial, was already preparing to move forward. For a king, the gravest danger is not defeat, nor rebellion, nor exile. It is something far subtler, being forgotten. Æthelbald ruled, but his legacy trembled on the edge of obscurity. By the middle of his reign, Æthelbald's rule had settled into a rhythm that felt permanent, but fragile. There were no great announcements, no defining reforms, no visible attempts to reshape how he was perceived. The kingdom functioned, but it did not advance. Stability existed, yet it lacked direction. For many kings, this would have been enough. Peace was rare. Quiet years were valuable. But for Æthelbald, quiet worked against him. Without victories or moral authority, silence became stagnation. People obeyed, but they did not believe. And belief was the currency of power. Æthelbald ruled a kingdom that moved forward without enthusiasm, held together by habit rather than hope. In 9th century Wessex, loyalty was fleeting. Noble families never rested their eyes from the throne, always weighing the future. And under Æthelbald, that future felt uncertain, fragile. He had no heir, no lasting legacy, no visible plan beyond mere survival. Quiet conversations began in shadowed halls, not rebellions but questions of succession. Who would rule next? Who could restore confidence? Who might reunite authority and trust in a kingdom grown wary? These questions went unspoken, yet they shaped every alliance, every calculation, every cautious gesture. Æthelbald remained king in title, but in the minds of many, his reign had already become provisional. A temporary bridge to the next ruler, a fragile pause in the flow of history. While nobles cast their eyes toward what was to come, the church looked both backward and forward. Monks continued to write, year by year, adding lines to the chronicles of Æthelbald's reign. Æthelbald ruled in an unusual calm. No armies crossed his borders. No rivals rose to challenge him. No rebellion tested his grip on the throne. But peace did not bring security. In an age shaped by violence, kings were measured by how they responded to danger. Æthelbald was never forced to act and never found a moment to define himself. What he protected went unnoticed. What he avoided left no legend. The silence of his reign became its own verdict. Without crisis, authority thinned. Without struggle, reputation faded. Stability, once a blessing, hardened into suspicion. People did not fear his rule. They simply stopped believing in it. History does not reward caution when it leaves no mark. It does not remember restraint when it lacks resolution. In a brutal century, inaction was not neutral. It was costly. And in the end, that quiet cost was the only legacy Æthelbald left behind. As time moved forward, Æthelbald's rule began to feel temporary, not because danger approached, but because meaning never arrived. A reign must carve its shape into memory. When it doesn't, memory closes in around it. And Æthelbald's kingship was slowly collapsing inward, toward one decision, one silence, one unhealed fracture. Nothing replaced it. Nothing redeemed it. The court sensed it. The nobles felt it. Even the land seemed to wait. Wessex did not rebel. It endured. But endurance is not loyalty. Beyond the rituals of kingship, beyond the formal echoes of power, the future was already shifting its weight elsewhere, quietly, patiently, without urgency. Æthelbald still wore the crown, but history had begun loosening its grip on him. And once that happens, a king is already fading. By the later years of his reign, Æthelbald of Wessex no longer appeared as a rising king, but as a passing one. Nothing dramatic marked the change. No rebellion erupted. No public condemnation followed him through the streets. Instead, influence drained slowly like water slipping through cracks in stone. The kingdom still functioned. Taxes were collected. Councils met. Laws were enforced. But leadership is more than maintenance. Æthelbald's authority had become procedural, not inspirational. In an age when kings were expected to shape destiny, he merely occupied it. The records say almost nothing about Æthelbald of Wessex in his final days, and that absence speaks volumes. There is no mention of sickness carefully observed, no slow decline recorded for pity, no struggle preserved for meaning. When death came, it did not announce itself. It arrived the way his reign had unfolded, without spectacle, without resistance, without a final act to reshape memory. In a century defined by blades and blood, to die peacefully was rare. But to leave no defining moment behind was far rarer and far more damaging. Æthelbald did not fall in defense of his people. He did not trade his life for renewal or absolution. There was no closing chapter, no transformation. His reign did not end in tragedy, it simply stopped. And in history, silence like that is not mercy, it is judgment. When Æthelbald of Wessex died in 860, the kingdom did not pause. There was no recorded mourning that echoed beyond the court. No voices rose from the church to sanctify his memory. No verses were written to preserve his name. The rituals were observed. The body was buried. Order continued. But remembrance did not follow. And in the medieval world, memory was everything. To be remembered was to endure. To be forgotten was a second death. Æthelbald received the crown in life, but not in history. No legacy demanded reflection. No loss forced reckoning. The kingdom adjusted, quietly and efficiently, as if releasing a breath it had been holding. Power passed on. The future advanced, and Æthelbald slipped into the margins, where kings go when history finds nothing left to say. No moment of uncertainty slowed the transition. A brother stepped forward and Wessex continued, steady, functional, almost unburdened. That quiet efficiency was the final verdict. Æthelbald's rule left no fracture that needed healing, no loyalty that demanded reassurance. The machinery of power moved on as if nothing had been interrupted. For a king, this was not stability. It was erasure. History often warns rulers to fear revolt, but rebellion at least proves relevance. Indifference is colder, more final. Æthelbald had held the throne, but he had not anchored it. And so when he was gone, the kingdom did not tremble. It adjusted. His reign ended exactly as it had unfolded, without noise, without resistance, without a reason to look back. Some kings fall, others are simply replaced. History chose a single memory, not the calm of his borders, not the continuity of his rule, not the fact that Wessex endured. Only the marriage remained. One decision swallowed everything else. 5 years of kingship compressed into a single line, repeated and unsoftened by time. In the margins of the chronicles, Æthelbald of Wessex ceased to be a ruler and became a caution. A lesson, not a legacy. The ink did not argue, it judged. And as his name settled into that narrow space between scandal and silence, the story of Wessex quietly turned the page toward a different kind of king. One shaped not by glory but by restraint, not by triumph but by watching others fail. History was done with Æthelbald, but it was not done learning from him. Æthelbald's death did not end his story, it reframed it. When a king dies quietly, history listens more carefully to what remains. And what remained after Æthelbald was not chaos, but unease. Wessex survived his reign. That mattered, but survival alone did not earn praise. Chroniclers asked a different question. What had been lost? Trust had thinned. Sacred boundaries had been crossed, and the crown had been worn without consent, even if it had never been openly challenged. Æthelbald became a lesson, not in tyranny, but in fragility. A reminder that kingship could be undone without a single battle. His reign forced Wessex to confront a truth few kingdoms admitted. Power without belief could endure, but only briefly. Medieval kings were not weighed by numbers or territory. They were measured by what endured, by the words monks chose to preserve, by the stories nobles carried forward, by the moments that refused to fade. Æthelbald of Wessex did not fail because he ruled with cruelty. He failed because he left nothing strong enough to stand against his one defining choice. No reform to shift the balance. No sacrifice to complicate the judgment. No moment that forced history to hesitate. Silence in the medieval world was not neutrality, it was absence, and absence hardened quickly. Without resistance, without redemption, routine became his only legacy. Over time, restraint stopped looking like wisdom and began to feel like evasion. History did not argue with his reign, it simply closed around it. And in that quiet closure, judgment was sealed. Wessex did what it had always done. It adjusted. The crown passed and the system recalibrated. Nobles stepped forward again. The church resumed its quiet authority. Stability returned, not through celebration, but through familiarity. There was no curse attached to Æthelbald's name. He was simply left behind, and that quiet exclusion was more cutting than condemnation. His rule did not derail the kingdom. It did not redefine it. Instead, it became a brief suspension in a much longer arc, a moment history stepped around rather than through. Yet even pauses leave traces. They expose fault lines. They sharpen expectations. They teach future rulers what cannot be ignored. Æthelbald's reign was not a turning point, but it was a warning. And warnings, when noticed, shape what survives next. While Æthelbald held the throne, someone younger was watching, not resisting, not condemning, learning. In the background of court life, a boy absorbed lessons no counsel could offer. He saw how authority thinned when trust disappeared, how legitimacy depended not only on law but on memory, how the church never forgot and rarely forgave. Power, he learned, could be inherited. Respect could not. Each silence, each withdrawal, each unspoken judgment became instruction. A living demonstration of what happened when a king failed to define his reign. That boy was Alfred the Great, and long before he wore a crown, he inherited something else first, a warning. Æthelbald never realized how carefully he was being observed, but history did, and it would remember the student far more clearly than the lesson. Æthelbald's legacy was not what he built, but what others learned from his failure. He demonstrated how quickly moral authority could collapse, how silence could outweigh stability, how kingship demanded more than presence. History did not erase him, it simplified him. And in doing so, it prepared the ground for a very different kind of ruler, one who would answer silence with action, hesitation with reform, and fragility with resolve. Æthelbald's reign was short, but its consequences were long. When a reign ends without drama, its meaning is decided later. In the years following his death, Æthelbald of Wessex became less a ruler and more a reference point. Councils spoke of continuity. Clergy spoke of boundaries. Nobles spoke of lessons learned. No one spoke of victories. The memory of his reign hardened into a single idea. Power taken quietly can be lost quietly too. And that idea shaped how kings would be judged going forward. Wessex had survived him, but survival now demanded more than silence. The church rarely needed to confront kings openly. It simply remembered. After Æthelbald, boundaries were reinforced. Marriage laws were clarified. Sacred roles were re-emphasized, not in response to rebellion, but to prevent repetition. His reign became a moral marker. Kings could rule without war. They could rule without praise, but they could not rule without legitimacy. The church ensured that future rulers understood this distinction clearly. For the nobility, Æthelbald's reign changed expectations. Quiet competence was no longer enough. Stability without vision felt dangerous. Nobles began to value kings who communicated purpose, who reaffirmed bonds, who understood the symbolic weight of their role. The crown could not simply exist. It had to mean something. Æthelbald had shown what happened when meaning collapsed. Failure teaches differently than success. Æthelbald's reign became instructional, not celebrated, not condemned loudly, but studied. How had peace produced doubt? How had silence weakened authority? How had one decision overshadowed years of rule? Wessex absorbed these questions deeply. The kingdom did not reject continuity, but it refined it. Kingship would now require clarity, purpose, and visible alignment with faith and law. By the mid-860s, Wessex was no longer the same kingdom Æthelbald had inherited. It was quieter, but more deliberate, more cautious, but also more demanding of its rulers. The shadow of his reign lingered, not as a threat but as a reminder. And soon, the kingdom would face trials far greater than scandal or silence. Trials that would require a king shaped by patience, discipline, and clarity. Someone who had watched failure closely. Someone who understood that survival demanded more than simply holding the throne. Peace is often mistaken for strength. During the later years of Æthelbald of Wessex, Wessex knew relative calm. No burning towns, no marching armies, no dramatic victories or defeats, but peace without preparation is fragile. The coastlines were quiet, yet scouts still watched the horizon. Monasteries rebuilt slowly, unsure whether calm was permanent or temporary. Nobles invested in land rather than defense. The kingdom exhaled, but too deeply. This was not negligence. It was human nature. Years of survival under Æthelwulf had taught Wessex to value endurance. Æthelbald inherited that lesson, but not its urgency. Peace became a habit, and habits shape kingdoms. Æthelbald was present, but distant. He attended councils. He issued charters. His name appeared on documents, yet the emotional weight of kingship never fully formed around him. Rulers in this era were not just administrators. They were symbols, anchors of fear and hope. Æthelbald ruled like a steward, not a standard-bearer. To the people, that difference mattered. Without visible conviction, authority thins. Loyalty becomes conditional. Respect turns quiet. This was not rebellion. It was erosion. One decision can outweigh 100 ordinary days. Æthelbald's marriage, already whispered about, became the lens through which his entire reign was viewed. It wasn't simply improper. It unsettled order. The church saw a boundary crossed. Nobles saw judgment clouded. The people saw confusion. Even those loyal to him struggled to explain it. Kings were expected to embody restraint. When that image fractured, it reshaped memory. From that moment on, every quiet year felt less like stability and more like avoidance. Æthelbald did not fall in battle. He did not abdicate. He simply died. No final decree, no redemption arc, no confrontation. For a kingdom already uncertain, the silence was unsettling. Transitions matter, and this one left questions unanswered. What had the reign meant? What lessons should be learned? What should never be repeated? Wessex moved on but carried the weight forward. Æthelbald's reign ended in quiet, but history did not. Beyond the horizon, forces were gathering. New Viking fleets, new ambitions, new dangers. The calm years were over. What followed would demand a different kind of king, one shaped by faith, discipline, and memory. Someone who had seen silence fail. The next chapter would test everything Wessex had learned, especially the lessons written in absence rather than blood. History does not record what is ordinary, it records what shocks, what surprises, what challenges expectation. For Æthelbald of Wessex, this was both a curse and a legacy. His reign, short and quiet, left almost no tangible mark. No expanded borders, no victories sung in halls, no reforms carved into law. Yet the memory of his most controversial act, the marriage to Judith, overshadowed everything else. Chroniclers would spend decades recounting it with subtle condemnation. The ink preserved judgment that the people had no words for. In a kingdom defined by trust and moral authority, one scandal could eclipse 5 years of survival. Æthelbald demonstrated the harshest rule of all. Kingship is not only a reign without decisive action carries its own weight. Æthelbald never faced full-scale invasion. He never made dramatic decisions beyond the scandal that defined him. Yet silence is not neutral. Inertia shapes perception. Nobles remembered hesitation. The church remembered boundaries crossed. People remembered uncertainty. In that quiet, lessons formed. Not loudly, not violently, but permanently. Wessex began to understand that kingship was more than wearing a crown. It was trust, moral authority, and visible alignment with both people and faith. Æthelbald's reign became a cautionary tale, not of ambition or violence, but of quiet miscalculation. While Æthelbald's silence weighed on history, another generation watched. A younger brother, Alfred, observed carefully. He saw the crown held but not commanded. He saw a kingdom survive without inspiration, yet teetering on mistrust. Lessons were absorbed quietly, observed in halls, in monasteries, in training yards. Alfred would later inherit not just the throne, but the record of failure, an invisible inheritance of warnings, cautions, and missed opportunities. History, in this way, preserves not only the deeds of the living, but also the lessons for those who come after. Æthelbald's legacy would shape Wessex in ways he could not imagine. The consequences of Æthelbald's reign were subtle but lasting. Peace remained, yes, but it was uneasy. Authority had to be re-earned. Marriage laws were reinforced. Clergy and nobles exercised newfound vigilance. Every subsequent ruler of Wessex would carry the echo of quiet scandal in their decision-making. In some ways, Æthelbald strengthened Wessex, not through action, but through lessons learned by those who observed him fail. Quiet, unremarkable, and morally questioned, his reign became a framework, a test case in how kingdoms survive not by glory alone, but by the careful balance of legitimacy, public perception, and moral authority. Æthelbald's reign was brief, uneventful, and morally complicated. Yet history remembered him not as weak or cruel, but as instructive. The story of Wessex does not erase him. It uses him. Every future king learned, sometimes painfully, that a crown is not just inherited. It must be commanded, respected, and justified in the eyes of the church, the nobles, and the people. The lessons Æthelbald left were invisible, but profound. They shaped Alfred, shaped Wessex, and ultimately shaped the survival of a kingdom under pressure from Vikings and internal fragility alike. He may not have conquered enemies or expanded borders, but he did something equally rare. He left a cautionary legacy that demanded reflection. Power without legitimacy, even if unchallenged, can fade. Stability without inspiration can crack. Silence in a kingdom is never neutral. The kingdom of Wessex had survived Æthelbald, but survival alone did not guarantee confidence. Nobles whispered in halls. Monks recorded silently. Every decision that came after his death was weighed against his quiet missteps. The subtle effects of his reign became clear. Boundaries had been tested, trust had been stretched, and precedent had been set for what could and could not be tolerated. Even without open rebellion, the memory of one scandal haunted governance. Kings who followed could no longer rule only with presence. They had to show competence, morality, and foresight. Æthelbald had unintentionally created a framework of accountability that would influence decisions for decades. History rarely measures influence by action alone. Sometimes it is absence, hesitation, or quiet misjudgment that shapes the future more profoundly than conquest. While the kingdom observed, one figure absorbed every lesson silently. Alfred, Æthelbald's younger brother, learned in the shadows of authority. He saw how the crown could be wielded, and how it could fail when divorced from legitimacy. He watched how trust eroded quietly, how scandal lingered, and how history could immortalize a misstep. This observation was not passive. It shaped Alfred's understanding of kingship. He would inherit not just a throne, but the lessons of 5 years of silent turmoil, subtle fragility, and moral ambiguity. Æthelbald had ruled quietly, perhaps unaware that his choices were training grounds for the next generation. And in that quiet, the foundations for Alfred's eventual greatness were laid. What does a kingdom inherit from a king who ruled in quiet? Lessons, caution, boundaries reinforced. The church and nobles became more vigilant. Expectations shifted. Stability became conditional, not assumed. Æthelbald's reign had been uneventful in outward terms, but internally it reshaped the understanding of authority. Kings learned that legitimacy could not be ignored. Silence and routine were not virtues. They were tests of perception and memory. And the memory of that silence would weigh on Wessex for decades. Every decision after him, every alliance formed, and every marriage considered was filtered through the shadow of what had come before. Scandal fades from the headlines of its own time, but its consequences linger. Æthelbald's marriage to Judith, once shocking, became a reference point for what could destabilize Wessex. Clergy tightened their oversight. Nobles reinforced social and legal norms. The kingdom itself learned caution through experience rather than conflict. Power without moral authority is fragile. Æthelbald did not discover this through battle. He discovered it through quiet observation by those who mattered. His reign teaches a subtle lesson. History is shaped not only by triumph but by the ripple effects of choices, both celebrated and condemned. In this way, Æthelbald's influence extended far beyond his 5 years on the throne. After Æthelbald, the kingdom turned its eyes forward. No open rebellion, no celebration, no loud mourning, just the quiet necessity of governance. Wessex had survived, but the understanding of kingship had changed. Authority was now inseparable from legitimacy. Respect could not be commanded, it had to be cultivated. Future rulers would navigate these lessons carefully, aware that even unremarkable kings could leave indelible marks. Æthelbald's legacy was not heroic or glorious, but it was transformative. His reign forced the kingdom to acknowledge the fragile balance of trust, morality, and authority. Quietly, Wessex prepared for what lay ahead. And somewhere, Alfred absorbed every nuance, every consequence, every silent lesson. The stage was set for a new kind of leadership, one shaped by the failures, hesitations, and invisible power of the past. Æthelbald's reign left Wessex with lessons not shouted from banners but whispered through memory. Kingship is more than crowns and armies. It is perception. It is trust. It is the invisible ledger kept by nobles, clergy, and chroniclers. Æthelbald ruled quietly, and in doing so, exposed the fragility beneath apparent stability. Peace without moral authority is thin. Compliance without loyalty is brittle. Decisions made in isolation, even if legally correct, can reverberate for decades. The church recorded every subtle infraction. Nobles measured every hesitation. Citizens observed every act, internalizing the lessons of caution and restraint. In this quiet, a new standard emerged. Power alone was insufficient. Kings had to be seen to embody legitimacy. Æthelbald had held the throne, yet failed to secure its full moral weight. While Wessex recorded history, one observer was silently absorbing it. Alfred, still young, watched the failures and misjudgments of his elder brother. He saw how easily trust could erode, how scandal could define memory, and how authority could exist without respect. These lessons were formative. Alfred would inherit not only the throne, but the knowledge of what had gone wrong, an invisible blueprint for survival and success. History rarely gives such apprenticeships in failure, but Æthelbald provided one. Through quiet example, he shaped the understanding of leadership for the next generation. Power without perception is fragile. Æthelbald's rule demonstrated this clearly. He had authority, yes, but it lacked the endorsement of faith, the affirmation of nobles, and the respect of posterity. His presence alone did not secure influence. Subtle signs of weakness became instructive. Councils hesitated to act. Clergy recorded with caution. Nobles rebalanced alliances. The kingdom learned that silence could be interpreted as acquiescence, indecision, or moral failure. Æthelbald's influence persisted, not through conquest or reform, but through the subtle consequences of choices observed, debated, and remembered. In this sense, history often rewards the quiet teacher as much as the bold warrior. The kingdom endured, but it endured differently. Stability now required vigilance. Decisions were weighed carefully. Laws, alliances, and marriages became instruments of trust as much as governance. Æthelbald had shown that routine alone could not sustain authority. Future rulers learned that compliance is not loyalty, that obedience is not endorsement, that survival without guidance leaves a kingdom vulnerable to memory, expectation, and perception. Æthelbald's reign, though quiet and controversial, became a framework, an invisible scaffold guiding Wessex toward the lessons necessary to survive far greater challenges ahead. Even in absence, Æthelbald's presence lingered, not in victories or reforms but in expectation. Kings learned to respect precedent, anticipate judgment, and understand that moral authority is inseparable from power. Every subsequent action in Wessex, every council, law, and alliance, was informed by the lessons of his quiet reign. Scandal, hesitation, and the subtle erosion of trust became reference points for leadership. Æthelbald may have ruled silently, but his influence resounded loudly in the consciousness of the kingdom. His story reminds us that history measures not only deeds, but the echoes of decisions across time. And in those echoes, the next generation, especially Alfred, prepared to rule with eyes wide open, shaped by the cautionary tale left behind. By the final years of Æthelbald's reign, Wessex had grown accustomed to quiet. The kingdom functioned, yet that very quiet revealed cracks. Nobles no longer assumed the crown's moral authority. Clergy recorded decisions with caution. Citizens obeyed, but they did not celebrate. Æthelbald's silence, once a shield, had become a mirror, reflecting every expectation left unmet. Peace persisted, but it carried tension beneath its surface. Stability existed, yes, but it lacked conviction. In hindsight, these quiet years would be read as formative. Not through action, not through victories, but through subtle guidance by example, both good and flawed. Æthelbald had shown the consequences of ruling without inspiring trust, and those consequences would linger long after the throne passed to another. In medieval kingship, moral authority mattered as much as armies. Æthelbald had inherited the crown legally, yet he never fully secured the consent of church, nobles, or posterity. Every action or inaction was scrutinized, preserved, and remembered. The subtle loss of legitimacy shaped the decisions of everyone around him. Nobles measured obedience. Clergy marked disapproval. Chroniclers recorded judgment. Æthelbald's reign became a lesson. Survival alone does not guarantee influence. Without moral authority, a king may rule, but his reign will be interpreted, remembered, and sometimes rewritten by those who observe. The consequences of Æthelbald's choices were quietly absorbed by the next generation. Alfred, observing from the sidelines, learned how fragile trust could be. He understood that obedience without conviction was unstable. That scandal could define memory more than years of careful rule. This silent education would prove essential. The young prince learned to combine authority with legitimacy, presence with moral guidance, and survival with foresight. Every hesitation, every subtle misstep of his brother became part of Alfred's curriculum in kingship. History rarely gives such direct instruction, but in Æthelbald's quiet reign, it was unavoidable. Alfred would inherit not only a kingdom but the lessons of absence, scandal, and fragile authority. Though Æthelbald ruled without conflict, the kingdom's stability was fragile. Internal order persisted, but it was maintained through habit, routine, and observation, not through inspired leadership. Nobles acted cautiously. Church leaders monitored events. Citizens complied quietly. History would later frame this period as peaceful, but peace without legitimacy carries its own risks. It teaches kingdoms to survive, yes, but it also teaches them caution, doubt, and vigilance. Every king who followed would internalize these lessons, ensuring that authority was more than inherited. It was earned, demonstrated, and remembered. Æthelbald's reign, though uneventful outwardly, became a subtle but powerful force in shaping Wessex's expectations of kingship. Stability without inspiration had consequences that extended far beyond his lifetime. By the end of Æthelbald's 5-year reign, the kingdom had survived, but at a cost few would initially recognize. History preserved his memory, not for grandeur, not for conquest, but for the lessons hidden in silence. Stability had persisted, yes, but legitimacy had been strained. Authority without moral weight became a template for caution, and caution would shape the next generation of rulers. Alfred, the younger brother, absorbed these lessons carefully. He would inherit not only the throne but the subtle warnings of what happens when authority exists without consent, when power is exercised quietly but without conviction. Æthelbald's influence was invisible, yet profound. He had shaped the moral and political framework of Wessex in ways battles could never teach. Future kings would act differently because of him. They would lead boldly, knowing that survival alone is never enough. And in that quiet influence, the stage was set for the kingdom's next great chapter, one that would define Wessex for centuries. Æthelbald's death marked the end of his reign, but not the end of his influence. Power passed smoothly to his younger brother, yet every decision in the years that followed carried the weight of his example. Wessex had survived him, but the kingdom had learned to measure kings not only by their presence but by their moral authority. Scandal, hesitation, and quiet indecision had consequences. Nobles consulted each other more carefully. The church asserted boundaries with subtlety. Citizens watched with quiet awareness. Every ruler after Æthelbald inherited a kingdom educated in restraint, vigilance, and the fragile nature of authority. He had ruled without drama, yet history remembered him more as a cautionary figure than as an absent one. His reign would become the invisible teacher to Alfred and all who came after, a reminder that authority without legitimacy is a precarious foundation. History rarely rewards those who avoid conflict. Æthelbald had avoided war, avoided rebellion, and avoided confrontation. Yet his reign offered lessons that would outlast battles. Moral authority, legitimacy, and public perception became the invisible pillars supporting Wessex after him. Nobles recalibrated their loyalties. Clergy reinforced moral guidelines. Citizens internalized the consequences of scandal. Stability endured, but it demanded constant vigilance. Æthelbald's quiet reign became a blueprint of caution, shaping expectations for what a king could and could not do. Survival, he had shown, was not enough. A crown taken without respect, even when unchallenged, is fragile, and the echoes of that lesson would guide Wessex long after his death. Alfred, watching from the sidelines, became the ultimate student of his brother's reign. He observed how quiet missteps could undermine authority, how scandal could overshadow years of careful governance, how peace, if unaccompanied by legitimacy, could feel precarious. This education was invisible but profound. Alfred absorbed lessons in trust, caution, and moral authority that no tutor could provide. Æthelbald's reign, though brief and controversial, became a formative guide for the next generation of rulers. In this way, failure itself became a tool, shaping leaders who could act decisively, morally, and strategically. Alfred would inherit not only a kingdom, but an understanding of the subtle power of perception, responsibility, and legacy. Æthelbald's reign demonstrates that influence is not always loud or visible. A king's legacy can be written not in victories, not in reform, but in the patterns left behind, the caution, the vigilance, and the moral lessons that shape those who follow. The subtle pressures his reign created strengthened Wessex indirectly. Nobles became more conscientious. The church asserted authority with precision. Citizens internalized the moral expectations of leadership. Every subsequent decision was shaped in part by the memory of 5 quiet, controversial years. Power need not always be exercised forcefully to be effective. Æthelbald's example shows that even silence can teach, even hesitation can instruct, and even scandal can guide future governance. By the mid-860s, Wessex was prepared for more than survival. It had learned caution, discipline, and the consequences of moral failure. Æthelbald had ruled quietly, but his reign created an invisible curriculum in kingship. Every subsequent ruler, most notably Alfred, would inherit these lessons. They would inherit a kingdom aware that authority without legitimacy is fragile, that power without respect is temporary, and that survival alone is not enough to secure history. This quiet education allowed Alfred to rise differently, equipped to confront Vikings, internal dissent, and moral scrutiny with a clarity his brother never demonstrated. Æthelbald may have avoided glory, but his silent influence prepared Wessex for the trials ahead. History rarely frames such quiet influence as heroic, but in the shaping of kingdoms, it can be transformative. The legacy of Æthelbald endured not through conquest or fame, but through the subtle education of the kingdom he left behind. Æthelbald's reign left no monuments, no sung victories, no widely celebrated triumphs. Yet in its quiet, it left a legacy stronger than many deeds of war. His decisions, or lack thereof, had created a framework within which Wessex would operate for decades. Nobles learned caution. The church reinforced boundaries. Citizens internalized the moral weight of authority. This was subtle power, invisible yet persistent. It shaped expectations of kingship, teaching Wessex that authority required more than birthright or obedience. It demanded legitimacy, moral clarity, and visible action. In the shadows of history, Æthelbald's reign became a silent guide. He had ruled quietly, perhaps even forgetfully, yet every move, every hesitation, every scandal contributed to a kingdom better prepared for what lay ahead. The most important observer of this quiet reign was Alfred. Every council session he watched, every charter he read, every reaction to scandal became an education. Alfred saw the crown held without conviction. He observed trust erode subtly. He learned how peace could mask fragility, how compliance could hide doubt. This invisible education shaped his understanding of leadership. He realized that authority without moral weight is precarious. Æthelbald may not have been remembered for victories, but he became a tutor in the art of survival, teaching what should be done differently. Through observation, Alfred absorbed lessons that would later inform his reforms, his campaigns, and his strategies against enemies and internal factions alike. Æthelbald's reign reinforced the delicate balance of stability and precedent. Wessex continued without war, yet each decision carried subtle consequences. Laws were observed carefully. Noble alliances were tested quietly. Clergy scrutinized actions more closely than ever. Every subsequent ruler inherited these invisible constraints. Peace, Æthelbald had shown, is fragile if moral authority is absent. Stability, while comforting, cannot replace trust, respect, or perception. His quiet reign became the benchmark for what would be tolerated and what would be remembered. Future kings learned that survival without legitimacy is only temporary, and that history remembers more than action. It remembers absence, hesitation, and misjudgment as vividly as it remembers victories. Even after death, Æthelbald's influence lingered, not as fame or glory, but as caution. His reign reminded Wessex that authority is fragile, that perception can outweigh power, and that moral legitimacy is inseparable from kingship. Every decision after him carried echoes of his subtle missteps. Nobles recalibrated alliances. The church maintained vigilance. Citizens internalized lessons in leadership and trust. In this way, Æthelbald's reign shaped the culture and expectations of Wessex more than any single battle could have. Stability persisted, yes, but it became deliberate, informed by the memory of silence and scandal. This invisible guidance prepared the kingdom for challenges that lay ahead, including Viking threats and internal tensions, teaching rulers the weight of both action and inaction. The stage was set for Alfred, who would inherit more than a crown. He inherited lessons in trust, legitimacy, and perception. He saw firsthand how authority could be eroded quietly, how a kingdom could survive yet remain fragile, and how silence could leave a legacy as impactful as any battle. Æthelbald's reign, though short and morally complex, became Alfred's silent teacher. He absorbed lessons on the importance of moral clarity, on the consequences of scandal, and on the subtle power of perception. In time, Alfred would transform these lessons into action. He would confront external threats, unify the kingdom, and earn a place in history that his brother never sought. But every step he took would be informed by the quiet warnings embedded in Wessex during Æthelbald's years. History often undervalues quiet influence, but in the shaping of kingdoms, it can be transformative, enduring, and decisive. Æthelbald's shadow, subtle and silent, had prepared Wessex for greatness without ever seeking it. The most enduring lesson of Æthelbald's reign was learned in silence. Alfred observed without interfering, absorbing the subtle dynamics of power, perception, and legitimacy. He watched how nobles weighed obedience against respect, how the church enforced moral boundaries, and how the kingdom endured without dramatic conflict, yet remained cautious, deliberate, and aware. In these years, Alfred learned a different kind of warfare, the war of perception, trust, and authority. He understood that leadership was as much about moral alignment as it was about decision-making. Æthelbald's reign, quiet and morally complicated, became Alfred's classroom. Every hesitation, every minor scandal, every act of compliance taught him what must never be repeated. The young prince would internalize these lessons and carry them into a reign defined not by mere survival, but by strategic foresight, legitimacy, and the unshakable respect of his people. Æthelbald's 5-year rule may have seemed uneventful, yet its precedent shaped the political culture of Wessex. Kings learned that silence could carry consequences, that moral missteps, even small ones, were never forgotten, and that authority required more than presence. Nobles, aware of these lessons, navigated their loyalty carefully. Clergy strengthened oversight. Citizens internalized the rules of engagement between ruler and kingdom. In this way, Æthelbald's reign indirectly strengthened Wessex. By exposing the limits of quiet rule, he forced the kingdom to evolve. Stability became deliberate, governance became cautious, and the stage was set for leaders who could combine authority with legitimacy, action with moral clarity, and foresight with obedience. The controversy surrounding Æthelbald's marriage to Judith became a lens through which his reign was remembered. It overshadowed routine governance and peaceful years, reminding Wessex that even quiet misjudgment carries weight. The church codified moral expectations. Nobles adjusted their alliances. Citizens internalized caution. Scandal, though brief, created a framework for accountability. It taught the kingdom that power is never neutral, and that perception can define history as decisively as action. Æthelbald's subtle mistakes, preserved in memory and chronicles, became invisible lessons that guided the next generation. Alfred, observing closely, would learn that authority requires moral clarity, foresight, and the ability to inspire trust. Wessex survived Æthelbald but not untouched. Peace persisted, yet authority had been tested. Nobles recalibrated their loyalty. The church enforced boundaries with vigilance. Citizens complied, but awareness remained. Survival alone, Æthelbald showed, is not enough to secure respect or legitimacy. This quiet transition prepared Wessex for future challenges. The kingdom had endured instability without war, and the lessons learned would inform governance, alliances, and the next generation's understanding of authority. Every action taken by Alfred, years later, would be shaped by the subtle guidance of observation. The throne had been held, the kingdom survived, and the moral framework for leadership had been quietly reinforced. By the end of Æthelbald's reign, Wessex was no longer naive about kingship. Alfred had observed firsthand how authority could falter, how moral missteps could echo, and how perception could shape survival. He saw that stability required vigilance, and that legitimacy was as important as power. The lessons of 5 quiet, controversial years became Alfred's invisible inheritance. He would rise differently, prepared, deliberate, and morally conscious. He would understand the fragility of obedience without trust and the power of perception in shaping history. Æthelbald's reign, though morally complex and outwardly uneventful, had prepared the kingdom for leadership capable of confronting far greater threats. Viking invasions, internal dissent, and the test of historical memory. History rarely frames quiet influence as heroic, but in shaping kingdoms it can be decisive. Æthelbald may not have sought glory or conquest, but his shadow prepared Wessex for survival, for resilience, and for greatness. Æthelbald ruled without fanfare, without dramatic victories, and without lasting fame. Yet in this quiet he became a teacher, not for soldiers or scholars, but for the kingdom itself. Wessex learned to observe, to calculate, to weigh consequences even in the absence of war. Nobles reconsidered their loyalties. Clergy reinforced moral boundaries. Citizens understood that authority could exist without admiration, and that such authority was fragile. Alfred, the young prince, watched closely. Every hesitation, every minor scandal, every council decision became a lesson in survival, perception, and legitimacy. He understood that a crown held in silence could be both preserved and undermined simultaneously. History often remembers the loud, the victorious, and the spectacular. But Æthelbald's legacy proves that even quiet, morally complicated kings can leave profound, lasting influence. The kingdom was educated, prepared, and guided, all without a single sword drawn in glory. Wessex absorbed these lessons cautiously. Stability persisted, but with vigilance. Authority was no longer assumed. It had to be demonstrated, reinforced, and morally justified. Nobles watched closely. The church asserted oversight. Citizens internalized a quiet awareness that kingship carried responsibilities beyond birthright. Æthelbald's moral missteps, though few and subtle, echoed through decision-making for decades. Peace, he demonstrated, is not merely the absence of conflict, it is the presence of legitimacy. And legitimacy, Wessex learned, must be continually earned. Every subsequent rule, Alfred absorbed these lessons quietly but deliberately. He witnessed how authority could erode even without challenge, how scandal could define memory more than years of careful governance, and how obedience without trust was fragile. These observations shaped his understanding of kingship long before he ascended the throne. Æthelbald's reign became Alfred's invisible school. He learned that leadership required more than presence or inherited rights. It demanded legitimacy, moral clarity, and foresight. Every choice Alfred would make in later years, against internal dissent or Viking invasions, was informed by the silent guidance of his brother's reign. In this way, failure itself became education. What Æthelbald did not accomplish, what he mishandled, and what history would remember as morally ambiguous became a template for the next generation to act wisely, decisively, and morally. Wessex emerged from Æthelbald's reign quietly strengthened, not by armies, not by conquest, but by education in perception, morality, and subtle authority. Nobles recalibrated loyalty, the church maintained moral oversight, and citizens internalized lessons about responsibility and governance. Stability now required vigilance, and decisions were made with greater awareness of consequence. Alfred, learning these lessons, began to understand that kingship was more than inheritance. It was active, deliberate, and accountable. Every choice he would make later, from domestic policy to military strategy, would be informed by the memory of a reign that survived quietly yet shaped everything. Æthelbald may have ruled without glory, but he left a framework, a moral, political, and cultural template upon which Wessex would rely in the decades to come. By the close of Æthelbald's reign, Wessex was prepared for challenges yet unseen. He ruled without triumph, yet his influence shaped perception, trust, and legitimacy. His reign demonstrated that survival alone is not enough. Authority must be continually validated. Nobles understood the limits of loyalty, the church the limits of tolerance, and citizens the weight of moral precedent. Alfred, observing silently, internalized every lesson. He saw how hesitation could erode respect, how scandal could overshadow years of stability, and how moral authority could be both fragile and decisive. Æthelbald's legacy, though quiet and morally complicated, became a foundation. His reign created the invisible scaffolding for Alfred's eventual rise. A king who would lead decisively, inspire loyalty, and secure Wessex's survival against threats far greater than his brother ever faced. The kingdom learned in silence that leadership is not merely survival or power. It is perception, morality, and foresight combined. And in this subtle, invisible way, Æthelbald's reign ensured that Wessex was not only ready to endure, but ready to thrive. Alfred, still young, learned a king's most important lessons by watching quietly. He observed how authority could survive yet remain fragile, how trust could erode even without open conflict, how scandal, no matter how small, could define memory and shape a kingdom's expectations. Æthelbald's reign was not heroic. It was subtle, morally complex, and at times controversial, but it was a masterclass in unintended influence. Every hesitation, every misjudgment, every quiet decision left traces that Alfred absorbed. History often celebrates victories, yet some of the most powerful legacies are invisible. Æthelbald's influence persisted in council chambers, in monasteries, and across Wessex villages. It shaped perception, expectation, and strategy, teaching that leadership is as much about morality and foresight as it is about power or conquest. Æthelbald's reign reminded Wessex that legitimacy is fragile, and authority without it is vulnerable. Though he avoided war and rebellion, the kingdom learned the subtle cost of silence and moral ambiguity. Nobles weighed every decision, aware that compliance without trust could falter. Clergy enforced moral boundaries with precision. Citizens internalized expectations about kingship, loyalty, and governance. The lesson was clear. Stability alone cannot sustain a kingdom. Leadership must be morally reinforced, visibly authoritative, and perceived as legitimate by all stakeholders. Æthelbald's quiet missteps became guideposts, teaching the kingdom, and Alfred, what would be necessary to survive future challenges. What Alfred absorbed was more than tactical or political knowledge. It was moral education. He saw firsthand how a king's decisions resonate beyond immediate effects. Scandal, hesitation, or failure to assert moral authority could ripple through governance and public perception. Æthelbald's marriage to Judith, though personally and politically controversial, reinforced lessons about boundaries, legitimacy, and consequence. The kingdom learned to measure authority not only by action, but by alignment with ethical expectations. Every council meeting, charter, and decision thereafter would reflect these lessons. Alfred's understanding of leadership became rooted in these quiet observations, shaping a king capable of combining decisiveness with moral clarity. By observing Æthelbald's reign, Alfred learned another crucial lesson. Survival without preparation is vulnerable. Wessex had endured 5 years without major conflict, yet the kingdom's stability was fragile. Nobles were loyal but cautious. Clergy were vigilant. Citizens complied, but trust was conditional. External threats like Viking raids would exploit any weakness in authority or legitimacy. Alfred recognized that a king must prepare not only for immediate dangers, but for the unseen consequences of inaction, misjudgment, or moral ambiguity. Æthelbald's quiet reign became a subtle template for what not to do and what to anticipate. The young prince learned that leadership is as much about foresight as it is about action, and that invisible lessons can be as critical as visible victories. Æthelbald may not have been a king remembered for glory, conquest, or reform, yet his influence was profound, subtle, and enduring. Through quiet missteps, moral ambiguity, and restrained action, he created a school for observation. Wessex learned how to govern cautiously, how to measure loyalty, and how to enforce moral authority without overt conflict. Alfred absorbed these lessons silently but deliberately. He learned that perception can outweigh power, that legitimacy is the foundation of authority, and that a king's influence often extends far beyond the visible acts of war or legislation. By the mid-850s, Wessex had inherited stability, but stability that required vigilance, foresight, and moral clarity. Æthelbald had ruled quietly, yet the kingdom had been shaped indelibly by his reign. Every future decision, from noble alliances to the defense of borders, would be informed by the lessons of those 5 complex years. In this way, Æthelbald's legacy endured, not as glory but as preparation. A silent teacher whose influence would empower Alfred to rise, unify, and defend Wessex when threats became unavoidable, and when leadership required more than mere presence. Alfred, growing into adolescence, carried a heavy burden, not of power but of observation. He had seen how his brother Æthelbald ruled, quietly, controversially, yet without open revolt. He noted how nobles reacted to hesitation, how clergy enforced moral constraints, and how the kingdom could survive but remain fragile. Every council meeting, every minor scandal, and every act of moral ambiguity became part of Alfred's education in kingship. This was a lesson no battlefield could teach. Alfred learned that authority is more than inheritance, and survival is more than obedience. Perception, morality, and foresight were just as vital as strength or strategy. Æthelbald's quiet influence shaped the very framework of Wessex. By watching and understanding this, Alfred absorbed lessons that would guide him in years to come. When threats became real, when leadership demanded decisiveness, and when the fragile kingdom required more than survival, the most powerful lesson Alfred learned was that silence can teach. Æthelbald's reign demonstrated that authority without moral weight is vulnerable, and that stability without legitimacy is fragile. Nobles and clergy recalibrated their loyalties and expectations. Citizens complied, but subtle tensions lingered. Alfred saw that every unaddressed hesitation and every quiet misstep carried consequences far beyond their immediate context. In these lessons, Alfred discovered the tools of foresight and governance. He realized that power is not only wielded through decisions, but also through perception, trust, and ethical alignment. A king may rule quietly, yet his actions, or inactions, resonate across time and shape the kingdom in ways both visible and invisible. Æthelbald's subtle misjudgments became guideposts for Wessex. The kingdom learned caution, vigilance, and moral responsibility. Nobles acted deliberately. The church monitored decisions carefully. Citizens internalized expectations of kingship. Even 5 uneventful years had left a profound mark. Alfred internalized these lessons. He understood that leadership requires foresight, that moral authority is inseparable from power, and that perception shapes legacy. Æthelbald's quiet reign had created a blueprint, not for conquest, but for enduring, morally anchored leadership. This was preparation without spectacle, a kingdom educated in restraint, accountability, and the invisible forces of governance. It was a lesson in survival, not through battle, but through observation and reflection. When Æthelbald passed, Wessex inherited more than a crown. The kingdom inherited experience, moral caution, and subtle guidance. Nobles had learned the importance of measured loyalty. Clergy had enforced boundaries with precision. Citizens had absorbed the invisible rules of kingship. Alfred would inherit not only authority, but also this framework, these invisible guidelines for how a king must lead. He would learn that trust cannot be assumed, that obedience alone is insufficient, and that stability without legitimacy is fleeting. The consequences of quiet missteps echoed louder than victories. Every choice Alfred would make in the future, whether forging alliances, confronting internal dissent, or facing external threats, would be informed by what he observed in those 5 nuanced years. Æthelbald's reign may not have been heroic, but it was formative. Its lessons prepared Wessex for challenges that would define its history. And Alfred, trained by observation, would become a king capable of applying these lessons in ways Æthelbald never could. The most lasting effect of Æthelbald's reign was the silent foundation it created. Wessex had endured, not through heroics, but through observation and adaptation. The kingdom had learned the importance of moral authority, legitimacy, and foresight. Nobles and clergy had internalized the consequences of inaction or moral ambiguity. Alfred had absorbed it all, preparing to wield authority decisively when the time came. History rarely credits kings for subtle influence, yet Æthelbald's quiet reign was transformative. It shaped expectations, defined boundaries, and educated the next generation in governance without a single battle. Stability persisted, but it was now deliberate, moral, and aware of the fragile balance between compliance and loyalty. Alfred's future leadership would bear the imprint of these years. Every strategic decision, every ethical choice, every calculated action would be informed by the lessons of his brother's complex, quiet reign. Æthelbald may have sought no glory, but he left Wessex ready for survival, for moral clarity, and for the trials that would define its destiny. With Æthelbald's death, the throne passed smoothly to the next ruler, but the crown carried lessons as well as authority. Alfred, no longer a passive observer, began to internalize the responsibilities that his brother's quiet, controversial reign had taught him. He had watched firsthand the fragile nature of obedience, the subtle erosion of trust, and the consequences of moral missteps. Every council meeting, every decision, every whispered comment in the halls of power became part of his education. This was no ordinary inheritance. Alfred did not simply inherit a kingdom. He inherited the moral, political, and cultural framework that Æthelbald's reign had shaped. Survival had been achieved, but authority had not been solidified. Alfred now carried the tools to transform fragile compliance into durable loyalty, tentative obedience into respect, and inherited authority into legitimate rule. The transition from observation to action marked the beginning of a new chapter in Wessex history. Alfred would now step forward, equipped with lessons etched by the quiet, formative years of his elder brother's reign. Alfred's early leadership was informed not by battle, but by careful observation. He had seen how Æthelbald's silence allowed power to persist, but also left the kingdom vulnerable to mistrust, scandal, and moral scrutiny. Nobles recalibrated alliances. Clergy monitored governance closely. Citizens internalized caution. Every subtle consequence became a lesson in the importance of legitimacy and perception. Alfred understood that survival alone was insufficient. Authority had to be earned through moral clarity, foresight, and visible action. He began to absorb the rhythms of governance, which decisions demanded firmness, which required diplomacy, and how public perception could amplify or undermine power. In essence, Alfred was learning leadership not through direct exercise, but through observation of the consequences of inaction and misjudgment. These formative years prepared him to confront both internal and external challenges in a way that his elder brother never could. One of Alfred's earliest lessons was the importance of a moral compass. Æthelbald's reign had demonstrated that legal authority without moral weight is fragile. A king may rule, yet be undermined by scandal, hesitation, or lack of perceived legitimacy. Alfred observed how these factors affected every corner of Wessex, from noble loyalty to church relations, from local governance to public perception. This silent, subtle influence became Alfred's guide. He began to understand that leadership requires both action and ethical grounding, that power without conscience is temporary, and that moral clarity can preserve both stability and trust. By internalizing these lessons, Alfred developed a framework for decision-making that would later allow him to respond decisively to threats, unify his people, and earn the respect necessary to transform Wessex into a kingdom capable of enduring extraordinary challenges. The quiet years following Æthelbald's death became a crucible for Alfred's emerging leadership. He learned to anticipate the needs of the kingdom, to measure loyalty, and to understand that authority is reinforced by perception as much as by decree. The subtle missteps of his brother had shown him that survival alone is insufficient. A king must inspire trust, maintain moral authority, and act with foresight. Every decision Alfred witnessed, how nobles negotiated power, how the church enforced boundaries, how citizens responded to governance, was a lesson in preparation. These formative experiences allowed him to understand the fragility of compliance and the strength of legitimacy. By the mid-850s, Alfred was ready to transition from observer to active participant. He had inherited a kingdom tempered by quiet lessons, a moral framework shaped by his brother's reign, and an understanding that leadership demands constant vigilance, moral clarity, and strategic foresight. Alfred's early preparation was built on the invisible foundation of Æthelbald's reign. Though his brother had sought neither glory nor conquest, his quiet rule had left Wessex educated in the consequences of moral ambiguity, hesitation, and fragile authority. Nobles and clergy had internalized these lessons. Alfred had absorbed them. This invisible education allowed Alfred to emerge not as a reactive king, but as a deliberate, morally grounded leader. He understood that perception could outweigh power, that legitimacy underpins authority, and that even peace carries hidden challenges. The subtle guidance of observation prepared him for battles, both political and military, that would come later. Every strategy, every reform, and every alliance would be informed by the silent curriculum of his brother's reign. Æthelbald may have ruled quietly, but his influence endured. He had shaped the moral, political, and cultural landscape of Wessex in ways that would empower Alfred, ensuring the kingdom's survival and readiness for trials that lay ahead. By the late 850s, Alfred began moving from silent observer to active participant in governance. He had witnessed the consequences of Æthelbald's quiet reign, the hesitation, the subtle loss of authority, the moral ambiguities, and now sought to apply those lessons. Every council session became an opportunity to measure loyalty, test alliances, and understand the intricate balance between power and perception. Alfred realized that authority was not inherited. It had to be earned through action, foresight, and moral legitimacy. Nobles watched him closely, assessing whether he would lead decisively or falter like his brother. Clergy measured his alignment with church expectations. Even common citizens were aware of the kingdom's fragile stability and were quietly observing the young prince's decisions. These early steps were unglamorous but essential. Alfred was not yet confronting Vikings or rebellions. He was consolidating the subtle forces that would make him a king capable of guiding Wessex through storms yet unseen. Æthelbald's silent influence remained embedded in every lesson he applied. Alfred understood that trust is the currency of authority. Æthelbald's reign had taught that stability without moral credibility is fragile. Alfred began cultivating relationships with nobles, listening carefully and acting deliberately. Each interaction was an exercise in assessing loyalty, measuring ambition, and reinforcing legitimacy. Clergy were central to this process. Alfred maintained their trust by respecting moral boundaries and demonstrating alignment with ethical expectations. Citizens, too, observed him keenly, learning that the crown's authority depended not only on inheritance, but on fairness, judgment, and visible engagement. This careful cultivation of trust laid the foundation for Alfred's future leadership. He was learning to balance firmness with diplomacy, decisiveness with morality, and action with foresight, a combination his brother had often neglected. Observation remained Alfred's greatest tool. He studied patterns of loyalty, the subtle power struggles among nobles, and the influence of the church. He noted how decisions could ripple across the kingdom, how hesitation or moral ambiguity could destabilize authority, and how even small actions shaped perception. By internalizing these patterns, Alfred began to anticipate challenges before they emerged. He understood that leadership required foresight as much as courage, and that the lessons of his brother's quiet reign provided a framework for navigating both moral and political complexities. These years were unremarkable to outsiders but formative. Alfred's consolidation of authority was a study in preparation, patience, and careful observation. Æthelbald's subtle guidance, through success, failure, and controversy, had laid the groundwork for a king who could act decisively when history demanded it. Alfred's early consolidation emphasized moral clarity. He had seen how Æthelbald's reign, though peaceful, had left vulnerabilities due to moral ambiguity and hesitation. Alfred resolved to lead differently, firmly, ethically, and with visible authority. Clergy were reassured. Nobles were tested, observed, and slowly aligned. Citizens learned that the crown's authority was active, not passive, and that leadership required both ethical grounding and strategic foresight. By exercising authority through moral clarity, Alfred strengthened the kingdom from within. The lessons of silent missteps became actionable knowledge, shaping how he approached governance, conflict, and loyalty. Æthelbald's influence, though indirect, guided every decision, ensuring that the kingdom's foundation was secure before crises arrived. Even as Alfred consolidated authority, the shadow of external threats loomed. Wessex had survived Æthelbald's quiet reign, but survival was never permanent. Viking raids had begun to escalate, and Alfred understood that preparation required both military readiness and political cohesion. He applied lessons learned from observing his brother, how hesitation could undermine authority, how trust could be fragile, and how perception shapes loyalty. Alfred began fostering alliances, strengthening defenses, and ensuring that the kingdom's nobles understood their obligations. He maintained moral clarity to reassure the church and solidify legitimacy. Every decision was deliberate, informed by observation, and guided by the subtle lessons of Æthelbald's reign. These preparatory steps were not dramatic, but they were critical. They ensured that Wessex would face external threats from a position of relative stability, moral authority, and strategic foresight. Æthelbald's silent influence, through example, controversy, and moral caution, had prepared the next generation for the storms yet to come. By the early 860s, Alfred began taking responsibility for Wessex in ways that would define his future reign. He understood that authority is not symbolic. It is earned through action, foresight, and moral clarity. Every council session, every discussion with nobles, every assessment of defense strategies became part of his education in applied leadership. Alfred drew lessons from Æthelbald's reign. Hesitation undermines authority, moral ambiguity erodes trust, and perception can shape loyalty as strongly as any sword. He observed carefully how nobles maneuvered for influence, how the church enforced boundaries, and how citizens responded to the subtle signals of leadership. Slowly, Alfred transformed observation into action. He began consolidating the kingdom internally, fostering cohesion among nobles, and preparing the population for challenges without causing alarm. His quiet preparation ensured that Wessex would not only survive but endure with legitimacy and moral authority intact. Alfred recognized that Wessex's strength depended on internal cohesion. Æthelbald's reign had shown the fragility of authority when moral ambiguity or hesitation went unchecked. Alfred applied these lessons to ensure loyalty and compliance through both guidance and visible fairness. Nobles were monitored carefully, tested through minor responsibilities, and rewarded for allegiance. The church's influence was respected and strengthened, reinforcing moral legitimacy. Citizens, meanwhile, observed that authority could be exercised decisively yet ethically. By strengthening internal cohesion, Alfred ensured that Wessex would face external threats with a unified front. Every decision reinforced the principle that stability requires both moral authority and strategic foresight. His leadership, grounded in lessons learned through observation, created a kingdom capable of enduring not just challenges, but the uncertainty and complexity of rule. Preparation for external threats became central to Alfred's emerging strategy. He analyzed past vulnerabilities, noting where hesitation or poor perception had weakened authority during Æthelbald's reign. Defense was not simply about walls and weapons. It was about coordination, loyalty, and morale. Alfred understood that the kingdom's survival required anticipation, planning, and subtle psychological awareness. He began consulting military advisors, evaluating fortifications, and training key nobles in leadership skills. Every action reinforced both the moral and strategic stability of Wessex. The lessons of his brother's quiet, controversial reign guided Alfred in crafting a balanced approach. authority anchored in moral clarity, action informed by foresight, and perception carefully managed to maintain trust and cohesion. These early strategic moves laid the groundwork for future confrontations with Vikings and internal power struggles. Alfred's ability to convert observation into action would define not only his own legacy, but the very survival of Wessex in the years to come. Alfred's leadership during these formative years emphasized balance, moral authority paired with strategic insight. He saw how Æthelbald's quiet missteps had exposed weaknesses. Hesitation, moral ambiguity, and perceived inaction had tested the kingdom's cohesion. Alfred resolved to avoid the same pitfalls. Authority, he learned, requires decisiveness, foresight, and ethical clarity. He reinforced noble loyalty through clear expectations and fair treatment. The Church's guidance was respected and integrated into policy, ensuring moral legitimacy. Citizens, observing the calm but deliberate exercise of authority, internalized the stability that comes from visible, ethical leadership. This balance prepared Wessex to respond to external threats without internal fractures. Alfred's emerging leadership was not loud or dramatic. It was deliberate, moral, and strategic, combining the lessons of observation with the necessity of action. Every decision he made was informed by the silent, formative years under Æthelbald's complex reign. By 865, Alfred had transformed the lessons of his brother's reign into actionable leadership. He understood that Wessex's survival depended on moral authority, strategic foresight, and unified governance. Nobles were aligned, the church reinforced legitimacy, and citizens observed that leadership required both ethical clarity and deliberate action. Viking raids were escalating, and external threats loomed larger than ever. Alfred's consolidation of authority, grounded in observation and tempered by moral and strategic insight, meant that the kingdom was no longer fragile. Every decision, from internal governance to defense planning, reflected lessons learned during Æthelbald's quiet, morally complex rule. Wessex had inherited stability, but Alfred inherited more. He inherited understanding, the invisible curriculum of leadership, legitimacy, and foresight. These years of preparation would become decisive in the trials to come. His emergence as a ruler was not immediate but deliberate. The kingdom would face storms that demanded both wisdom and courage, and Alfred, guided by the shadow of his brother's reign, was ready to act. By the mid-860s, Alfred was no longer just an observer. He was a leader in the making. He had absorbed the lessons of Æthelbald's quiet, morally complex reign. Hesitation erodes authority, moral ambiguity undermines trust, and perception can be as decisive as action. Wessex had survived Æthelbald's rule, but survival alone was not enough. Alfred understood that true leadership requires foresight, decisiveness, and legitimacy. Nobles began to see him as more than a prince. They recognized a leader capable of balancing ethical guidance with strategic planning. Clergy observed a ruler attentive to moral authority. Citizens sensed stability through deliberate action and visible engagement. Every council, every decision, every observation reinforced Alfred's authority. In these final years of preparation, Alfred consolidated the kingdom's political, moral, and strategic structures. He was shaping a Wessex that could withstand both internal tensions and the looming threat of Viking invasions. Æthelbald's silent influence had prepared the foundation. Alfred was now ready to step forward and lead. Alfred's consolidation emphasized preparation for the storms ahead. Viking raids were escalating, and Wessex could no longer rely on mere survival. Alfred strengthened defenses, coordinated with nobles, and ensured that the church supported governance through moral guidance. He understood that authority alone would not secure loyalty. It had to be earned through foresight, ethical conduct, and strategic action. Internal cohesion became a priority. Nobles were aligned and tested, citizens were reassured through fair governance, and the kingdom's moral and political structures were reinforced. Alfred applied the lessons of observation. Hesitation, perceived weakness, and moral ambiguity could destabilize a kingdom faster than any external threat. By the end of this period, Wessex was more unified, morally grounded, and strategically aware than it had been under Æthelbald. Alfred had taken the invisible lessons of his brother's reign and transformed them into actionable leadership, ensuring the kingdom was ready for the trials that history was about to deliver. Alfred's early leadership emphasized balance, moral authority paired with strategic insight. He had learned that kingship is fragile when perception falters or ethical boundaries are ignored. Æthelbald's quiet reign, morally complex and controversial, had provided a blueprint. Authority must be visible, legitimacy must be reinforced, and foresight must guide action. Alfred implemented these lessons deliberately. Nobles were given responsibilities that tested loyalty and judgment. The church's guidance was respected and integrated into governance. Citizens, observing fairness and clarity in leadership, began to trust in the crown's authority. This combination of moral and strategic leadership prepared Wessex for the inevitable challenges ahead. By embedding these principles into governance and training the next generation of leaders, Alfred ensured that the kingdom could withstand both internal tensions and external threats. Æthelbald may not have sought glory, but his reign created the foundation upon which Alfred would build a resilient, enduring Wessex. The transition from observation to action marked Alfred's emergence as a capable ruler. Every lesson from Æthelbald's reign, the consequences of hesitation, moral ambiguity, and subtle scandal, was now applied. Alfred moved decisively, ensuring that loyalty, trust, and legitimacy were firmly established across the kingdom. He oversaw the training of nobles and soldiers, reinforced alliances, and strengthened defenses. Citizens recognized a leader who combined ethical clarity with strategic foresight, a king prepared to act when circumstances demanded decisiveness. Alfred's consolidation was not flashy or dramatic, but it was profound. The quiet lessons of the previous reign allowed him to lead with insight, understanding the intricate balance between perception, loyalty, and authority. In doing so, Wessex was no longer a kingdom merely surviving. It was a kingdom prepared to endure, adapt, and resist the storms of history yet to come. By the end of this formative decade, Alfred had established the foundation for Wessex's survival. Æthelbald's reign had been quiet, morally complex, and at times controversial, but it left lessons that would shape the next generation. Alfred absorbed these lessons about moral authority, perception, foresight, and the fragile balance of power, and applied them to strengthen the kingdom internally. Wessex was no longer passive or fragile. Nobles were aligned, the church reinforced legitimacy, citizens recognized ethical leadership, and defenses were prepared. Every decision, every observation, and every action reflected the invisible curriculum provided by Æthelbald's quiet reign. Alfred was ready. The kingdom had endured, learned, and grown stronger in preparation for the challenges that would define its history. The legacy of quiet influence, moral guidance, and strategic observation ensured that when the storms of invasion and internal tension arrived, Wessex would not only survive, it would endure, guided by a king who had mastered the lessons of the past. This is the story of survival, preparation, and the emergence of leadership that would shape the destiny of England. In the 9th century, Wessex endured not through heroic battles or legendary victories, but through lessons learned in quiet observation. Æthelbald's reign was subtle, morally complex, and at times controversial. He did not seek fame nor victory, yet in his compromises, hesitation, and careful stewardship of authority, he forged a foundation, a kingdom shaped by loyalty, foresight, and moral guidance. His influence, invisible to many, became the framework upon which the next generation would build. Alfred absorbed these lessons. Every counsel, every decision, every moment of observation became part of his education in leadership. He learned that true authority is earned, reinforced by clarity of purpose, perception, and strategic foresight. When Alfred later faced Viking invasions and internal upheaval, he drew on this unseen legacy. Æthelbald's quiet reign had prepared the kingdom and its future king for survival. This is not a story of glory. It is the story of preparation, endurance, and the invisible power of wisdom.